Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me tonight. Having Brian and the National Trust as part of this partnership is really crucial. Well, this is great. I can feel like I'm
There's
on
a shorter one if you want.
what is it? These TV shows? I can be a talking head or something like that. Yeah, this works. Thank you so much. That's good.
I like the dating game.
Yeah.
Queen for a day.
Well, how I got into this is a little bit different from Brian. It's Brian's career job at the National Trust, and it's really great that the National Trust has a lawyer actually in their regional office out here. Their chief counsel of a litigating nature is Betsy Merritt in Washington, and she covers the whole country. She was my compatriot for the years we had to litigate the 710 freeway and then settle the case. And we are very close now to, that case was filed by South Pasadena in 1973. And it may be dismissed as final with the stipulation that the freeway will never be built. That may happen in the next month or two, we hope. And Betsy's been there for that whole ride, but now we have Brian here. He does look like he's younger than 35, so we're in good shape on that. Two personal notes. One was, the Western Regional Office means a lot to me personally because I got hired by South Pasadena in 1988, and that was because I had experience in doing some preservation work. The Orinda Theater came just before that. One case that we lost, sadly, was the City of Paris case in San Francisco. If the law then were what the law is today, that building would still be standing, notwithstanding Willie Brown's very effective representation of Neiman Marcus to tear down that building. So I got hired by South Pasadena, went down there to check out the file, noticed that the National Trust had already been there, suggesting that they get to work with the city. And the card was that of the regional director, and I thought, knowing how I'd worked with the trust on the Orinda Theater and some other stuff in New York in the early 80s, I should get to know this person. Well, I got to know her pretty well. We've been married now for 22 years. And our daughters will graduate from Berkeley High this spring. So that's been a little personal side there. The other personal side is I'm looking here at the buildings in the Civic Center. Now, for 26 years, our office was downtown in Hayes Valley. And we were down there when Hayes Valley was a real frontier place to be. Kind of miss those days now that it's become the trendiest and most expensive blocks in San Francisco. But it came time to think about moving, and so seeing how downtown Berkeley was beginning to really come together in many respects, and with the girls at the high school, I thought, gee, it'd be nice to go help out with a game 2 blocks away instead of having to leave an hour early. I started looking for an office in downtown Berkeley, thought it would take a year, it took 1 day. You guys see John Gordon's sign all over the place. John has a lot of buildings. I met John Gordon at my office, and I invited, I didn't trust my law partners or my law staff. I had Kathy come down. I think we found the place, and we did. So we're right around the corner, 2014, and I'm looking at these buildings, and I'm seeing New City Hall, Berkeley Public Library, Veterans Building, and I think that's it. Those are all designed by James Plachek, who also designed the building that I'm in 2014, the little terracotta building right next to Kamal. And in fact, not only did he design that building, but that was the building in which he worked to design these others. So we try to keep the preservation theme going here. About the time we did that, I think we were still over in the city when the Berkeley Post Office started to emerge as an issue. And the one thing that made this case attractive to me, aside from the fact that the post office was acting kind of like the Corps of Engineers acted 50 years ago, namely that we can just ignore laws, environmental laws, was the fact that the city council, fractious, as you know, was unanimous on this issue and has stayed that way. So it was an easy job when Zach Cowan, who's an old friend and colleague in his past life, he also was a sole environmental practitioner. When the city said they're going to need some help to do this, and obviously knowing what the environment is economically here in Berkeley, where we've lost Iceland, we've lost Willard Pool, streets, pavement could be a little bit better. The city could not afford to really hire someone to take on this post office case. So this is an easy call to make. In the end, because I think, as Brian said, we're going to make some good law out of this. And, you know, in the end, trustfully, both the trust and our office will be able to recover attorney's fees for this. It's a chance we're willing to take. But why does this case stand out as such a great test case, as Brian has mentioned? I mean, the first element is very strong community support. That is that's indispensable. City councils can come and go. I mean, there's no guarantee that a future council will stay the same, but active citizenry in town will kind of make sure that the council stays the course. Believe it or not, in the 710 freeway case, there were a few times in those 28 years when it looked like one or two council members might be willing to make a deal with Caltrans and go south on us. And what kept the council going was the citizen activism. So seeing the support that the Save the Berkeley Post Office, I think, Gray, you were the one who actually brought me into this. I mean, I've known Gray. We were taking different roles in the Mono Lake case. We both spend our time teaching up at the university, trying to exist as the lowest rungs on the ladder of the University of California that treats its part-time teachers so well. I think Gray was the one that called up, and we had a meeting in Brian's office that kind of started to put this together for two reasons. The first is the National Historic Preservation Act, which Brian has mentioned. The second is the National Environmental Policy Act, which you're probably more familiar with that. That's the one that requires an EIS whenever you have a major federal action affecting the human environment. These were the tools that we used in the freeway case. We used the state equivalent of NEPA in the Orinda Theater case. The interesting thing about both of these laws is that they actually do not give any federal agency the authority to disapprove what the post office is proposing to do. They're very process-oriented. The National Historic Preservation Act requires that before another federal agency can undertake an action that has an adverse effect on a national registered property, they have to take into account the agency that's proposing to do that has to give the advisory council an opportunity to comment, and the agency that's proposing the project then has to take that into account in its final decision. So I don't know how active the advisory council was on this post office issue until our case arose, but I think Berkeley was really the catalyst. Brian, you can tell me if you think I'm off base here, but I think we were kind of the catalyst to bring the advisory council into the same activist role that it took that explains why the 710 freeway was killed. And up to then, the conventional approach had been, as Brian pointed out, well, if they're going to sell an historic post office, we can mitigate that by preserving its architectural and artistic features and ensuring that those are available to the public. And you know, that's better than having the building demolished or significantly altered or totally privatized. Well, Brian mentioned Venice. I mean, they signed off on a pretty severe privatization there. I think the deal there is that the public only gets in for 6 hours a year or something like that. And they signed off on that. So the advisory council was not being very aggressive until our case came along. And Barbara Lee has a lot to say about that. The fact that our former state historic preservation officer and former president of the California Preservation Foundation is now the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Those types of connections never hurt. And so we became kind of the focal point even before we got to court as an example of what the Advisory Council should do when confronted with what is proposed here, namely an unconditional sale of the building to the highest bidder for whatever private use they want to make of it. The advisory council did two things. First of all, it started critically looking at what the post office was doing, and ultimately came to the conclusion that they were just never going to propose a covenant that really protected the building, and we'll come back to some of the terms in a minute. But the second thing they did, as a result of Barbara Lee attaching to the Budget Act about a year ago this time, I guess, they actually had to prepare a report to Congress on the post office and historic post offices and how well they were being handled by our government. And that report came out quite critical of what the Postal Service was doing. And what was really satisfying about that report is that the city of Berkeley added a dimension that had not yet been openly discussed in the debate about the future of post offices in America. And that was that in other cities may be satisfied if the building can be retained architecturally and put, for example, to a different public use or a worthy private use that has public access. For example, Palo Alto is now one of the bidders to buy the post office in Palo Alto and use it as a municipal building. So use did not seem to be, and Palo Alto would propose to keep the post office in the front of the building. But use of the Berkeley Post Office has really been, I mean, that's been the focal point of your campaign, as much as preserving, you know, the beautiful neo-Renaissance architecture that, of course, has a very distinguished Florentine history. And so we kind of took one section of the National Historic Preservation Act regulations that had kind of been ignored, which says that loss of historic use can be an adverse effect. And in their report to Congress, the Advisory Council picked up on that theme and essentially said, yeah, you know, I think that's a good idea that we should enforce our own regulation that requires us to account for the loss of historic use as well as the potential damage to architectural and artistic features. And so where the Advisory Council, to its credit, did not back down, but did not have an opportunity to finish its comment. The Postal Service just wrote, after proposing this ludicrous, you know, fox in the chicken coop notion that it itself would administer the covenant. They just said, we're done. And that in itself is unlawful under the National Historic Preservation Act. They could be honest and say, we know we are producing an adverse effect in terminating the use and in restricting public access and in not guaranteeing the integrity of this building over reasonably foreseeable time. But they didn't do that. They said, we're done with you now. We don't even have to answer to that. So that's essentially the National Historic Preservation Act claim. And notice that there's not an approval there. There's an obligation to comment and listen. And that's how these cases are won, when the government agency just bullheadedly refuses to listen. As I say, there's a very strong comparison to where the post office is today and where the Federal Power Commission and Corps of Engineers were back before Dave Sive, who was probably the founder of modern environmental law, challenged that in the Scenic Hudson case and a proposal to build a pump storage facility along the scenic part of the Hudson up in upstate New York. And the Second Circuit said, as a citizen group, they can bring this claim, and more importantly, the Corps of Engineers has to consider environmental values, which they've refused to do. Well, the NEPA claim, doing an environmental impact statement, which is very important primarily because the environmental impact statement, aside from requiring a documentation and an assessment of the environmental impact of one's proposed